Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are. It's very nice that so many of you have come back for day two of this kickoff meeting for the Current and Emerging Threats to Crops Innovation Lab. Um, we just had a quick poll up there by Annalise. So glad to see that overall, over 80% are doing well or are good or fantastic. So that's great. So hopefully that continues for the rest of your day or afternoon, wherever you are. So what we wanted to do today was to focus on the money part. The Current and Emerging Threats to Crops Innovation Lab is like many innovation labs. It is an agreement between USAID and a US land grant university, ourselves, Penn State. And a large part of our responsibility is to disperse funds. So USAID provides money to us. Currently, it's $15 million guaranteed over 5 years, with the potential that could go up to $39 million. So the idea would be that they would give us roughly $3 million per year for 5 years. And in the process of these 5 years, we would find other money at USAID missions in the Feed the Future countries. And that can be through what's called a Leader with Associate awards or some other mechanism. So we could approach those missions, or those missions might be investing in things which are of interest in their countries. In addition, we expect that there will be other funds available from USAID DC. For example, the emerging crisis around climate would lead to funds for example, dealing with threats that are driven by climate change or biotic threats that are compounded by climate change. The administration is, of course, really heavily focused on climate change, and the global food security strategy that we talked about yesterday mentions this a lot. So there's a lot of money, up to $39 million. And some of that money is just kept by Penn State to run the operation. That's us as a management entity. So that's us employing staff members, myself, focus on the administration. But then the majority of it, and at least by USAID standards, that has to be at least 50%. But the majority of the money should be used for grants to drive forward this research for development. And remember, yesterday we talked about how research for development is such a key component of all of this. So there's been lots of ways in which we've seen this happen over the years at these innovation labs, and they're good. The way in which we thought to do it was to sort of take a leaf out of the book at the Gates Foundation, where they have used these smaller pots of money. So let me just begin sharing my screen, and I can show you some of the components that we were thinking of. Okay, so we're just going to spend time explaining the RFA process, and then a lot of what we want to do today is discussions, because we have our idea about what should happen, but this is a global community of players working collectively to solve the problems of current and emerging threats. So of course it's critical at this early stage to gain insights from the community about what they think should be funded and how it should be funded. So we'll have discussions among you all. So I wanted to remind you all what the vision was. It's research for development through a global platform. It's critically important that we keep this research for development in mind, where there's very important operations of scale-up efforts to do outreach. But what we want to do is recognize that we're in a changing world, and as the quote talked about yesterday, rise with the occasion, so that we can adapt to this changing world rapidly and not minimize the suffering overall. we want to have a transformative change. Unfortunately, there will be a transformative change whether we do anything or not, but it can be transformative change in the negative. So we saw yesterday how the state of food over the last 4 years from the FAO reports is showing a downward trend. 811 million people now food insecure. And we saw that quote in the GFSS, the Global Food Security Strategy, talking about 92 million people who are now food insecure because of COVID, just directly because of that. So we're going in the wrong direction. We want to make sure we go in the right direction, especially in the context of climate change. And a critical component, both for USAID and now increasingly all of the innovation labs, is to make sure we empower the NARS, the national agencies of research inside the country. So that would be universities or ministries for agriculture or research bodies, as well as the private sector inside the country. So we're very, very keen on empowering those. So we've heard yesterday about some examples of that. For example, Dream Team Agro Consultancy in Kenya doing that very large project on integrated pest management. That's a really clear example of that. Or Inera, we heard yesterday from Burkina Faso. So to remind us all of the vision, we want to be in a better place in 2026 than we are in 2022 or 2021. We're focused on current threats and emerging threats. We have this acronym, Fitter Farms in 5 years. So let's break that down. We didn't break that down fully yesterday. So we want to enable forecasting. We want to know what's likely going to happen in the next couple of weeks, couple of months. We can have forecasting for the next couple of weeks or months, or we can have forecasting for 2030 and 2050. And to my mind, and forecasting for 2030 and 2050 it gives us a false sense of security, because no one's going to come back in 2030 or 2050 and say, hey, you got it wrong by 74%. It's not going to happen. So it gives us the idea that we're preparing. But of course, across Eastern Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania, we have people moving into the current cropping cycle. And those people are being impacted by the worst drought since 1981. So we must forecast what's going to happen next week, and then next month, and then for the rest of the cycle. So we think that's pretty important. And forecasting also should be at the ground level. So it should be in field and in season. So those are two components. Inspecting. So we need to enable, we can't fight what we don't know. So we need to inspect, and then we need to build that capacity through training. The goal should be to have tens, if not hundreds of millions of farmers using integrated pest management practices across all of the various crops and stresses they encounter, as well as using the same approach to combat climate change. So it's really critical that we have training. So the kind of work that, say, Diane Saunders was talking about yesterday with Dave Hodson of using genetic testing and phylogenomics, they're doing an excellent job, but we need to scale up their capacity so they can train. And that's also, of course, a big component of what MARPL has historically done and will continue to do through the Innovation Lab. And then to have that force multiplication, we want to have training of trainers. We want to build the capacities of youth and women for the use of the AI-based extension system. So we know we can build AI tools that are as good or better than humans. And we also know that there's just not enough humans in the system. There's not enough extension workers. We also know that collectively we're declining in our technical ability rather than increasing our technical ability. And so this all opens up the opportunities for AI to play an important role in helping us diagnose the problem and training people, as well as software in general, not just AI. And then we have to evaluate the success of all of these strategies. And then we have to conduct research, particularly on the socioeconomic impact on gender and youth, as we heard about yesterday. For emerging threats, we want to have a situation whereby we can forecast, so we can do detections of anomalies through surveillance and remote sensing, as well as machine learning. We want to assess these anomalies. So if something is emerging and it's a problem, we want to assess that rapidly. We want to conduct rapid research. And for this, let's really kind of think about what happened with fall armyworm over the last 3-4 years now, particularly in the first 2 years. We just were not doing enough research on this. And so that means the pathogen was able to move rapidly. And then contrast that with the kind of research we did for COVID. So during the crisis, we did a lot of research on the efficacy of different approaches, and then we were able to scale those out. And of course, scaling requires markets. So a large part of Innovation Labs is to engage with that. And then the surveillance. So did it work, the efforts that we proposed? So we're planning a permanently open call. We oftentimes you might see an Innovation Lab putting out a call, and then there's a large number of people putting in by a deadline, and then the money is apportioned. But the fact is, none of us know the threats which are coming. We don't know what we don't know, and so we need to have this adaptive responses. And we were very happy that USAID have really joined us in this adaptive management framework. They understand the importance of this, and so by having a continuously open call, we expect that people can reach out to us and say, hey, there's a problem here, it needs our attention. I have a way to do research on this. For example, there's an outbreak of African armyworm in Kenya. We were hearing about from FAO yesterday, and this could be a huge problem, or it could be not so huge problem. So we want to enable approaches to this. We want to avoid, and this is one of the things that Rob Bertram, who is the senior scientist at USAID, has consistently emphasized. And after this call, I'm in a meeting at FAO where he's leading a steering committee on fall armyworm with him. But he's often emphasized the problems of chasing ambulances. Just because it's bright and it's red and it makes lots of sound doesn't mean we have to chase it. So we simply cannot chase all the problems which we're going to see in the coming years. And because that would exhaust the supply of money and responses, and it would drain the donor community, which we've seen in the case of the locust crisis. And so by setting up these smaller pots of money, we hope to build a resilient, interconnected network of researchers who can, with patience and attention, focus on the problem and develop research for capacity for dealing with those problems, as opposed to these rapid. So one of the research for development avenues might be, what's the biggest threat? In the Innovation Lab, we often talk about the top 5 threats for the top 5 crops. So pick a country like Burkina Faso. What are the top 5 crops? What are the top 5 threats of each crop? And how do we deal with those? Are those threats related to calories of food for people in the country, or are they related to export crops? If you think about a country like Ghana, of course, a really important crop is cocoa, because it's important economically, and it is threatened by the diseases we mentioned yesterday, swollen shoot, black pod, but also compounded by climate change. So these are the kind of things that we want to hear about from the community. So what we're now going to do is try to gauge your interest. So we wanted to open up some rooms and have a general conversation. But before we do that, I wanted first to see if there was any initial questions on what I had shared from the audience. So first question from Andy was what are the duration of the awarded projects? So we're aiming for 12 months with the idea that we can extend. We showed you yesterday the partners that we brought together for year 1, and that they were called quick win partners. But it's not the case that we plan to continue with them for 5 years. We may. We're building excellent relationships with them, and so we may continue to fund them. We may work with them to find funding from them from their missions, but it's not guaranteed. So we were thinking for new partners coming on, it could be 1 year funding with the idea of continuation if it's an important area of research for development. but thank you for the question, Andy. Kareem? Are you muted, Kareem?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. I just have a question, David. Who can take a lead on these proposals? Does it have to be host country collaborators or international partners or both?
Yes. Sorry, I actually should have mentioned that. So Serge had prepared these nice slides for us. Oops. So I think you can see my screen here. So projects funded under the RFA must have one principal investigator based at a qualified institution. So for example, Dr. John Chalal, who's at Moy University, or also associated with the Dream Team Agri Consultancy Company. The PI from the eligible NARO institution must be actively involved in the crop threats management and food security research. So for example, you at Michigan State could join up with, so let's take Marisol Quintanilla. She's been working with Oscar Koch at the University of Nairobi, or Christy Sprague has, and they could link up together. So Christy could link up with Oscar, and they could develop a project together. So it's coming from MSU and a researcher at the University of Nairobi. And these are the countries that we're focused on, let me go back, all these countries here. So that's a good question. And so it's a linkage between yourself at a land grant and somebody else.
Okay, so we can submit the proposal through MSU, or does it have to come from Kenya side?
We're able to make awards directly to NAROs, as we have done in the Quick Win projects. We're also able to make awards directly to MSU, as we've done.
Okay, thank you. This is helpful.
Bruce, wonderful to have you here.
Good morning. Glad to join. Thanks for opening this up, David, to allow us to sort of learn a little bit about what's going on. Historically, the predecessors of these programs have focused both on the subject matter and on the capacity building through academic training of different sorts. The approach you're outlining charts a new course, if you will, and I'm curious what the leadership team is thinking about in terms of student training. $100,000 projects may not go that far, for example, especially if you've got a limited time duration in terms of a conventional graduate program, for example. Yesterday, some of our colleagues talked about the great success they're having bringing folks with bachelor's training into the system. But I'm trying to think, as I love this notion of focusing on the things that are truly in the moment and emerging. And I'm also thinking about how do we sustain the capacity in our partner institutions and organizations to be able to address these questions in our next generation. When we step down, who's going to follow in our shoes with the capacity? So that's the bulk of the question, David, I guess, is there a thought about how you're addressing educational opportunities? I hear things in what you're describing even this morning that could be, if we're willing to think differently, some very, very creative approaches about education. It's just a different outcome. Maybe it's more short courses, more certificates. Maybe it's things when you're talking about enabling women and youth to be conversant in AI. Maybe it's a hackathon kind of concept to actually engage the next generation in creating some of the tools that we need. So, any thoughts on sort of educational components, even as we move with the technical solution piece of this?
Yeah, so we certainly want to experiment and iterate. And if we find something's not working, we're really comfortable with stopping that and declaring we're moving in a different direction. We're certainly in this first 6 months massively increasing the capacity of these young people who are focused on the field in Nepal and also in Kenya. And predominantly in Kenya, we have these young people who are developing these efforts. This FAO meeting I'm going to go into later on will show how Brenda, who's on the call here, and Winkate and many others, nine of them specifically, what they're doing is, I think they've released 560,000 parasitoids. They've met with frictions in the artificial, the supply of artificial diets. So they've done an in-country supply. And they've also scaled up production in the labs. They've also worked with Bapana, who's a Penn State entomologist, and Serge, who's also at Penn State, historically as a scientist in virology, and they've worked with those individuals to increase their capacity in doing research on the ground, all remotely. And I think that could be a new model instead of going to Michigan State for 2 years, because the cost of sending one person to Michigan State for 2 years might be equal to having these 9 people trained in entomology with ICIPE and then with experimental design with us. But from this, how would we recognize that those people are good? Well, one way is we bring those people into our calls with USAID. So Mercy Tata on the call comes to our weekly meetings, and she represents, she's a media coordinator. So she represents those young people, but she also gets used to being in a room full of predominantly North American based people, predominantly, oftentimes men, and not in the USA group, but in other meetings, and oftentimes older men. And you know, Bruce, you were a provost and a head of department, and that's how the landscape is dominated. So by bringing these young people, oftentimes younger women in, we develop the soft skills in how to manage a meeting. One of the objectives we had is to build up their capacity and soft skills by helping them run meetings. James Mugo on the call runs meetings with the World Bank in Uganda, for example. So that's good in terms of building the scientific literacy and the soft skills necessary. But how could somebody who's outside of our orbit look at Brenda or Mercy or James and say that person is capable and I want that person to run my, you know, has the necessary qualifications? So with Kareem at Michigan State, we're talking about a certificate program. So Michigan State are leaders in international development. So we could have a certificate program. And we've been watching very closely the new, essentially Google University. So Google has revolutionized some aspects where they're doing professional training in Android development or product management. And we could have something like that for the land grants, where you could get a degree or a certificate from Penn State, Michigan State, Purdue, or wherever, and you could have that. One of the ideas that we're thinking about, which I think is very urgent and important, which is a sort of climate change adaptation program or professional, so CAP. So the idea would be this CAP program would allow you to then say, I have training from the Innovation Lab on the biggest current threat, which is climate change. I have a certificate from Michigan State about this. So now I'm in my home country of Nepal or Kenya or wherever, and I'm going to be enabled to go to the Ministry for Agriculture and talk about this, talk about aspects of water moving in soil, talk about aspects of meteorological changes, talk about crop water balance models, and so on. So we certainly think that the model we're developing is cheaper. It is. Is it more effective? That's important. And so somebody could come to us and say, hey, we'd like to study this. What has been the effect of the historical model of bringing people for 2 years? And what is the effect of the model you propose? Now, just because we're proposing something which is new and cheaper and perhaps bigger in scale, doesn't mean we can't also have this 2-year, 3-year model of somebody going to Ohio State or Iowa State or somewhere else in order to do this. That's also on the table, and people can advocate for that. Just because we've said grants of 100,000 doesn't mean it has to be like that. We're open to be convinced.
Very helpful, Dave. Thanks for that. And just creating a sustained capacity is so critical, and you've outlined a number of ways. I would submit that if we as educational institutions have failed to learn from the past couple of years of teaching in entirely new ways, then shame on us. And we need to think about different credentials that match the marketplace. There's a human tendency to love to have the accomplishment of something like a certificate. And so it doesn't just help in the marketplace, it's actually something that raises the self-esteem of the participants as well. And so finding that blend of new with the old, but really being willing to push the envelope with new ways of doing the training, I think is absolutely essential. So pretty heartening to hear what you've got in mind there.
So before we go on to Subi's question, does anybody from the Dream Team would like to jump in from anywhere in Kenya or Nepal? Like to add some comments to what I've said about your capacity to be in the room and to get training now? James, I specifically mentioned you, or Brenda, or Mercy. Would you like to, either any of you like to say something?
Okay. Okay, sorry for that.
Go ahead.
It's usually something really unbelievable when I look at our work and I see an organization trusting my emails. And when I had the discussion, when Bruce brought it up, I was very keen to hear what you'd answer. And I'm very happy that everybody is thinking about you are growing old and you need the replacements. And you've given us that chance. And there's nothing that we are usually very proud of than this chance that we've been given. We usually see it with the old generation in our country, and they don't retire. We just wait, and no one's going. So it's a nice discussion and nice answer, David.
Great, thank you, James.
Thank you. I also think I have a point on this. It gives a lot of energy to a young person when you like James says, people maybe in our country wait for someone, maybe leading this post should be someone 60 years or 70, but you got this experience and you teach other people, and maybe you do it as a group. It gives you energy, and on itself, it's some experience, a big experience. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Brenda. And I think we all should remember, so my background is in rainforest ecology, and some of you in the US institutions might know about Dan Jansen's successful project under the National Science Foundation effort. So the problem we have in biodiversity studies, which I worked on, is that most of the taxonomists are in Europe or America or Japan. And most of the interesting life on Earth is in the tropics. And Dan Jansen's model was something called parataxonomists. Take young people with minimal training from, say, high school, particularly in Costa Rica under National Science Foundation grant, and then fund them to collect the samples and sort them into major groups, and then send them. So do most of the work, and that massively increased capacity and then massively increased our ability to do surveys. And it was a very successful model. And I think, Brenda is a great example of this, because she is a very keen entomologist. Bruce, you'd really like her, and she's doing excellent work on parasitoids and all the issues around building a lab, understanding the artificial diets, having her colonies collapse, building those colonies back up, all the stuff that we have. But the extreme advantage she has over an American-based student, whether it's Kenyan or American or some other nationality, is she's there 5 days a week. And she walks out of her lab into a field, and she can get more samples or more food for the diet or whatever is the case. And that's just killer. It's just amazing if you have that, of course. I mean, I've done lots of field work around the world, and if you spend a lot of time in the location where you're sampling, then things go better. So thank you so much, James and Brenda, for that, and Bruce for a very thoughtful question. Subi.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you, David, for that overview, and I really appreciate this idea of having an open call for immediate funding on issues that are emerging. In that way, I just want to know whether the call is already open, because you said it's an open call. There are a lot of emerging threats that also is coming up. For instance, the spotted wing Drosophila suzuki was reported last year in Kenya. We need to still have an understanding of how far it can spread and what kind of damage it can cause before it spreads out widely. It is more restricted to certain foods, but then it can spread out widely. Then other example is golden apple snail on rice, which was also reported recently. This apple snail is actually turning out to be a bit more of a damage-causing pest in the rice systems in Africa. So issues like this keeps coming up. So I really appreciate this approach of keeping a call open, and I relate it to the previous TCP programs of FAO that was there, and if that is an opportunity, I appreciate it. My only concern is, as we're looking at the emerging threats, there are also certain path-breaking innovations that comes for long-standing problems. Is there an opportunity for also to test such kind of path-breaking innovations, if there are any, for previously having long-standing innovations? And I support Professor McFerrin's views on how do we look at capacity building with a shorter funding cycle and a longer funding cycle. That will be very critical, because this is definitely related to sustainability of all those interventions that we are contributing to.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. So I think we've had an example of the things that we want to achieve. We know some problems, but of course, it's only a small percentage of the huge problems. And you, based in Nairobi, in ICIPE, with your huge network, or somebody like Dave Hudson with his huge network and CIMMYT, are really tapped into the problem. So with Dave, for example, we were speaking about last week about maybe some problems in China regarding wheat. And we've talked about the issues of Ukraine yesterday with wheat, which is also being talked about extensively. And then we might have an issue in Nepal with wheat rust. And so Dave has this huge network of people, as you do. And so you and Dave and other people are going to be excellent to tell us what the problems are. And so we want to open up a constant dialogue. So tomorrow we'll hear about how we'll have these subgroups, and I hope that you can be part of those groups, and really emulating the model we had from CGIAR in ProMusa. So we can constantly hear everybody's complaining about this golden apple snail. This is really important. Here's pictures of it. We can have WhatsApp exchanges, and we can see it's very damaging. That's what's happening with African armyworm at the moment. And so if you're part of that conversation, then of course we're going to think about you as a person to have money for funding for this. So we want to use the fact that we do have an ability to give out money to canvas widely on all of the threats which are around and which are important and prominent. So that's one way in which we'll respond. So it is open immediately. You can send an email. We could put that in the chat, but it's on the website. You can also put the website in the chat, please. But you can send an email now, and that will open up a conversation. And so, for example, it most likely will mean that Serge and I will jump on a call with you. And since Serge and I are both agronomists and disease biologists, we'll have a very enjoyable time talking to you about the problems. And then we'll help you craft the application and design it, and then we'll bring it forward to USAID to get their stamp of approval that it's a good application, and then we'll start to roll out some money. That's the idea. Now we've sort of put all our money into year one, but you know, as we're coming up to year two, we'll have funds available to get things out the door. In addition, though, what also we should be doing is telling the donors what needs to be funded and how important things are. Now, I've been rather critical publicly of some of the conditions that have been created over the last many years in this space, which is essentially a Hunger Games situation where small pots of money are placed out and we all have to fight for them. And that's not good. It's not good for international development, and it's not good for research. And an example of this was the Gates Foundation call that came out, Smart Farming, which came out. Some of you may have applied for it. I'm looking at Jean, I'm guessing she has, we applied as well. And that was 2,100 applications for 5 funded projects. And that is a net negative for global food security, because how much time did Jean and me and lots of other people put into that could have been best applied elsewhere? And I get that Gates were overwhelmed, et cetera, and there's lots of other examples of this. The Innovation Lab, for example, many good groups applied, but it's just not enough money. So I think it behooves us as domain experts, especially if we're spending a lot of time in the field where these problems are occurring, to help the donor community understand where the money should be spent, and also making sure we have synergism. So we have the Plant Health Initiative that we're partnered with. Prasanna is on our board, and so we want to make sure that if they're spending their money every year, which I think is about $10 million a year for the next 5 years, and we have up to $40 million or 39, so how are we spending that money in an intelligent way that gets economies of scale, so we don't replicate things. And not just Plant Health Initiative and USAID, but we also talked to Danida, which is the national organization, or we talked to somebody getting funding from them in Denmark with Dave Hudson for Rust Tracker. And we want to make sure that Danida is funding work which is complementary and not a repetition. So they were funding work in potatoes in late blight in Kenya. How do we make sure we're not just constantly reinventing the wheel and spending money? And how can the Innovation Lab help you by virtue of the fact that it's a platform? So that's another component, I would say. And the third component relates to your question of how do we build larger efforts? Well, that's really important. And yesterday we really signaled out Diane Saunders at the John Innes Center, which is that extraordinary capability in developing mobile technology through MARPL. And so it's really important that groups like that who can just do excellent work because of their long period of training are funded. And we want to, that's not $100,000 grant, that should be a larger grants. But we certainly need to build the capacity, because one of the problems that we foresee is that we'll become complacent. And where something is a success, like the Rust Tracker, we'll think, oh, it's a success, we don't have to worry about it. And that was a mistake we made in the United States with soybean rust. It was very successful, and then because of that, we stopped the surveillance, and then it came back as a problem. Same thing for fall armyworm in the United States last year. It's a huge problem because of a very early spring and a very late fall because of climate change. So we have to be constantly aware and constantly do surveillance. So I hope that addressed your questions. I think Jean, you had one, so welcome. Did you see everything yesterday in the quick wins? Will I just run through those?
Oh, sorry.
No worries.
I had a conflict yesterday and missed that, but I just was thinking as you were talking, for these 100K second round grants, linking in with what's already established, like you just said, in building economies of scale would be really important. So a recap on that. I don't know if everyone was on the call yesterday or not. But.
No problem. So we had implementing partners. One of them was Dream Team Agri Consultancy, doing a very large IPM package in Kenya. So parasitoids to control fall armyworm, clean seeds for maize leaf necrosis, intercropping, which is also beneficial for fall armyworm, and then also in improving soil quality and soil fertility through intercropping. Climate smart agriculture using drought proofing with biochar, but also FuseNet data over 40 years, and then a bioherbicide from a private company controlling striga, so a weed. Working with ICIPE, building capacity in scaling up parasitoids and releasing them, but also conducting research on the economics of the intervention of parasitoids. Working with IDE in Nepal, so coordinating with CIMMYT to do surveillance, already a link between two groups there, IDE and CIMMYT. Working with the GEAR effort at Penn State, which has worked with a number of innovation labs, making sure we bring gender in, and also as a cross-cutting team. ANERA in Burkina Faso, adaptive research and new IPM packages, particularly around high-value crops, but also intentionally building the capacity in Burkina Faso through ANERA. MIT, using advanced machine learning, what's called agricultural scientific machine learning, where when we have small amounts of data, we can still use that data to forecast problems before they become endemic issues. With Michigan State, working on building capacity through training and content. We just mentioned the certificate a moment ago. University of Maryland Eastern Shore, as a historically Black college and university with an existing an excellent research program across 19 HBCUs. So making sure we're bringing in the HBCUs to be competitive for grants, but also, as with many HBCUs, the faculty are oftentimes from many different countries, which is really excellent. So in the case of UMass, they 8 faculty we work with, and each one is from a different country originally. And it's really just wonderful because they have a lot of strength. So we're going to focus on banana in DRC and maize and mango in Kenya. Zamorano in Honduras, as we reach out to Central America and the Caribbean. So it's Honduras, Guatemala, and Haiti, and they're working on something dear to you, which is late blight, because it's a lot of potatoes coming from the Netherlands, and we want to avoid incursions, but also as a staging ground for scaling up our dream team with the private and public sector to focus on coffee and corn and beans in Guatemala and Honduras. We're a strong partner with the CG systems, so we're working with SIP to do point of care diagnostics, again, something that you care about a lot, building capacity for late blight, working with Euroblight and America Blight on our ability to detect resistance and strains like A13 blue that you know all about, so that we're understanding how problematic late blight is becoming and having better tools to track it. These are the kind of tools that I mentioned with John Innes Center, Marple Technologies, but we're also really open to your work on the pins and the point of care diagnostics and LAMP assays and other affordable tools. And one could ask a question is, can we, which is cheaper and which is more efficacious, Nanopore or your pin system? And then as a management entity, we're sort of trying to bring this all together by providing access to our platform and greasing the wheels, not just in terms of satellite observations of fields, but also running large programs. For example, the 80 or 90 Dream Team members in Kenya, how do you keep all that going? And not only that they can collect the data, but they can be trained, as we've heard from James and Brenda about training. So I hope that addresses some of your questions. And yeah, we have that on our website as well, so you can see some details there. Al Fatih.
Thank you very much, David. I was just to follow on Subi's question on the next call. Yes, I understand there is a number of new emerging threats that we can always look at, but I was just wondering, for the current quick wins, well, for ECP, we're doing a very good job, I guess, and then we'll complete the project on time. But just in case that while we're implementing this, like there's new ideas for the same problems that's coming out, could we also apply for some kind of like second phase kind of a thing to address the same issue, but in more like ideas coming through while we're implementing this one? Yeah,
absolutely. And remember, it's not just applying to us, it's working with us so we can both apply to the missions. So we have the $15 million, but we should be competing for the additional $24 million. But in addition, there's more money that we should compete for, because the size of these problems requires a massive investment. So I think Annalise often says this about, what was you say? Don't be risk of, what is the word you use from Schmidt Futures about?
The risk scarcity.
Yeah.
Scarcity mindset.
So we had money early on from, would you like to explain it from Schmidt Futures?
Sure. So I believe in late 2019, we had received a gift donation from the Schmidt Future Group as part of a way to move our organization out of the scarcity mindset. They recognized that we had quite a bit of talent on our team, but were restricted in financial ways to implement and drive our success. And so with that unrestricted funds, we were able to actually respond very rapidly to the desert locust crisis, and with that then secure more funds in the future. But without that initial bucket of unrestricted funds, we would not have been able to continue on our efforts on climate change adaptation, and more importantly then rapidly assess and respond to the desert locust crisis then.
Thank you so much. And so this mentality is important because I think it's really critical that we move away from this Hunger Games situation, that we're just happy with small, either we deal preemptively with these current and emerging threats, or we react to the problems that come about. And we all know that building in resilience is so much more important than having to deal with, for example, the billions of dollars lost and spent on the fall armyworm response because it moved. So in which way, if we had been effective in Togo in 2016 when it came in or into West Africa, in which way could we have responded? And so I think this mentality is important as a framework. And it's also, if we take that attention, then I think it is important for us to advocate strongly to the donors about the necessary investment. I mentioned Rust, for example. That is a massive success story, but we have to ensure that everybody hears about it always, and then we keep on funding it, because if we don't, then things break out. And again, I think we're in an easier position because of COVID, that everybody understands breakout infections, they understand Omicron, they understand problems as they emerge and spread. So I think that's a lesson that we've learned. So absolutely, you can pitch ideas and talk to us, and definitely see this not as a, so obviously we've applied for lots of money, and it's hard to be on the other side and you're asking for money you don't know, you're trying to read the tea leaves, but that's not what we want. We want you to have open and frank public engagement, so we can have more meetings like this about the money, but also private engagements between myself and Serge, where we talk about the biology, and then we talk about, well, how could we raise that money? How can we work with you to raise that money? And obviously we're going to be able to drive much of that conversation. So for example, I have the good fortune to be engaging with Senator Casey's office, the senator in Pennsylvania. He is the one who's been driving forward putting forward the Global Food Security Act, and then it's coming up for renewal in 2013 or 2023. And part of that is the budget item. You know, how much do we need? We have a lot of evidence from CGIR that $1 spent is $10 back. We know that investment in agriculture in developing world countries has a fourfold return, better than anything else. So I think it's important for us to build our capacity, and we have a unique opportunity because we have the Innovation Lab and we have the Plant Health Initiative, and we have national initiatives like the one in Denmark I mentioned. NORAD are investing about $5 million into Malawi. So how do we make that money go further by being a joint international consortium, and also using technology to our advantage, so we don't have to reinvent the wheels and have shared learnings from one place to another. So I hope that sort of long-winded way answers your question.
Yeah, that's useful. Thank you very much.
Super. So what we were hoping to do at this stage was to try to go into breakout rooms, and we wanted to do it on nationality. So yesterday, Annalise had some data on...
Sorry, David, that's not going to work because we have too many people attending from different countries,
Okay.
so which is an excellent problem. So I decided to do it based on regional center.
Great. Perfect. So
that's
that will
in the
perfect.
code.
And the idea is that when you go into these breakout rooms, we hope to be able to ask you a question in the poll, which may or might not work in breakout rooms. We'll see. But a question that we do want you to consider is our idea of 100,000 beginning grants, is that a good idea? We've taken it from the Gates Foundation. We've liked it. But it may not be, because the question that Bruce raised is that, if you're trying to fund a student in North America, that's all of a sudden $60,000 a year. So that might not be a good idea. Or the sort of stuff that Subi mentioned about larger programs. So maybe you want to breed for resistance. So maybe that's something that CGIAR should fund, because historically that's what they've been doing. So have those conversations. Obviously, if you're going to be in Eastern Africa, and you're looking at $100,000, that's great, because the cost of labor is cheap, and you have access. You don't have to travel. You have access to all the fields and do your research in West Africa or East Africa. So just consider those questions. I think we're going to stay out for about 15, 20 minutes or something, and just have a conversation. So please drive it forward. We also have a Google Doc that you can put notes into, that Annalise made. So if you want to scribble down some notes while you're talking, and then we'll come back and continue our conversation. Thank you so much. Okay. Wow, that was, at least in the room I was in, it was super interesting and exciting. Maybe just we'll do a little bit of reporting out of it, and maybe I'll go to where I was, which was Central America. Oh, you had the current threats. Will I share my screen, Annalise? And I'll just talk about thanks. I'll just talk about what we were observing. So we had some conversations about problems. So remember, in Central America, we're focused on potato at the moment and rust, just to get going. But of course, maize, bean, and coffee are hugely important crops, the three most important in Honduras. And Denise was talking about things like tar spot and coffee rust. Jean Riciano at NC State had talked about linkages between existing programs like the World Coffee Research Foundation and USDA's effort in Hawaii, which we're already linked with, showing the benefit of the platform. And then it was very nice that we immediately had Jean and Denise talking about synergies and pre-existing knowledge of the country. Jan Kreutz obviously has worked closely with Denise, coming from the Potato Institute, so they had things to talk about. We then went into a large conversation about capacity building and research. So Bruce McFerrin, with his deep experience, talked about online courses, how we can leverage the benefit of the last 2 years in online learning and working remotely, particularly to have courses so we could train in countries. Those courses could be about domain problems of nematodes or bacterial infections or whatever, as well as epidemiology, which was something Jean mentioned. So people could be trained in that. Bruce McFerrin reminded us that Ohio State had created 4H, which is a phenomenal program that was designed to deliver education low cost. And then another important point was having people fluent in technology. We mentioned this yesterday, how Pete McCloskey, our AI engineer, is training AI researchers in Kenya who are now on the field in Uganda. So developing that capacity, which is really, really good. And we also talked about where would this stamp of approval come from. So one idea would be that a US seal is important. This was from Denise in Honduras and Zamorano, that if you had a stamp of approval from Michigan State or Penn State or Ohio State or even USAID, this is going to carry weight in Central America. Language is critically important. Students in Zamorano could speak English, but we need to make sure, of course, the content would be in Spanish. That's really important, and we completely agree with that. In terms of the amount of money, $100,000 for kickoff a project would be good in Zamorano because of the cost of labor. And then Denise was really interested in, does it have to be on the biology of the pest, or could it be on the socio-political outcomes or issues around gender? And the answer is absolutely yes. We could have that. But then the counterpoint, and as we had kind of thought about in our general discussion, is that 100,000 K is not so much from the perspective of a US university because of the high cost of graduate students, and especially if you want to have graduate students involved, the idea would be that it could be larger amount of money. So that's a very valid point from Marisol at MSU. So who wants to take the Asia room? Pan, I guess.
Yeah, so we discussed about like how whether there's 100K funds would be good amount of money to start anything related to the this emerging threat IPM Innovation Lab. And we discussed like for local institution, if we give that money to local institution, maybe it will they could accomplish some tasks like capacity building, and also good for a small research project for undergraduate student, and for a small workshop and quick win project for disease and insect pest emergencies. But it could not, it is like a pretty small amount of money if we'd like to include big organization, because of their high cost, and a larger project and long-term project could also be like it couldn't be sufficient for large and long-term project. And David Hudson suggested that maybe we could start with a small amount of grant, like give 100K for first year, and depending on how those institutions perform on their first year, maybe then we could give them more money to work on the same project for long-term successful project. So it was a suggestion from David Hudson from CIMMYT, and we have some suggestion from Rajan, who is faculty in one of the agriculture campus in Nepal, and he was also like saying yes, the involvement of academia sector with research sector, they could do something, like they could accomplish few things with that amount of money. So this was a note for the fund, like that small fund. And we have, if you go up, we have also discussed some other like threats. Are we also discussing that? Yeah. Could you please go up? Yeah, about the current threat, there is a so we have listed some of the current threat in Nepal and also in Asia, which are like wheat blast, wheat rust, and citrus blight, Asian citrus psyllid, and Chinese citrus fly. So this Chinese citrus fly is like it's originated from the China, and now it is a big problem in citrus farming in Nepal, because the citrus is one of the major fruit crops and also commercial crop in Nepal. And in Asia wide, if we talk about the Asia, fall armyworm, it's also a major problem there. And wheat bipolaris, maize stack rot, Fusarium head blight, they are also like major current problem in Nepal. And we also talk about emerging threat in Nepal and also in Asia. David Hudson mentioned blast and rust. These are the predicted threat in the entire continent Asia. And
And they could also expect like new races of yellow rust and steam rust because of this climate change. And spot blotch in wheat is also like another threat in wheat crop in Nepal and also in Asia.
Thank you so much, Papana. And then do we have notes for East Africa, maybe here?
Yep.
Or thanks.
Yes, we did it a little bit differently. All our notes are underneath the 3 questions, and we didn't talk about the 100,000 money. I figured it would be a poll question. So I can just briefly go through. For the current threats, we fall armyworm was the first one that was brought up, and then we spent some time discussing, you know, why is this still a challenge? It was mentioned that you, David, had said it started in 2016 and now it's 2022. And so we talked about farmers' strong reliance on synthetic pesticides and the continuing prevalence of the host due to the 2 cropping seasons. And so there's a need to intensify the methodologies that are working and continue on that. Also, that was added for Kenya and general East Africa region was the Drosophila suzuki, which is fruit fly species, citrus greening disease, desert locust, Tuta absoluta, straggleweed, maize lethal necrosis, general viruses and insect vectors, specifically viruses that have not been identified properly. And then we have abiotic threats included, which is drought and climate shocks. We talked specifically in Uganda about the coffee berry borer, the twig borer, and the rust diseases. And then for Uganda and Congo, we discussed banana with the Fusarium root wilt, rhizome root rot, and then also how to minimize impact of vectors by intercropping with some legumes. And then for the emerging threats, we kind of briefly just got into the variable rainfall patterns and how with some periods of heavy rain expected and longer periods of no rain, there's a higher risk of flooding and drought. And so a potential quick solution is to focus on short period crops. And that was
super. Very, very specific and detailed. That's excellent comments from the room. Excellent, great. Serge, for West Africa?
Yeah, for West and Central Africa, we first for Burkina Faso, we had a participant working on, we also structured it in that way, the current threat they're working on cereal viruses, different viruses they found on cereals, but few of them cause a lot of damage on these cereals, on sorghum, maize, or millets. So those viruses are MCMV, MSV, and DMV. And they're collaborating also with Central African Republic University that's sending them samples that they're working on their lab. So Koala here that gave these viruses they're finding in these countries. And in RCA, they found MSV mostly in that causing a lot of damage in the country. And another working group, Janda, that their group is working on fruits dieback, on mango, on cashew and citrus that caused by a complex of fungi that's Serratia laziplodia, SPP, and Colitrichum. And those complexes are causing the different issues they're finding on these trees. And also some anthracnose on fruit trees as mango, cashew, and citrus, and some other fungal diseases on citrus and some other cash crops. And in vegetable crops, the main issue they have presently is alternarios on onion crops, and also in tomatoes and some brassica crops as well. And the Tuta absoluta is really present, and Helicoverpa as some pests they're finding on vegetable crops. And we have in Ghana a group working on alpha toxins and some IPM methods for post-harvest in management for groundnuts. And one issue also is the the seed system is not well developed. So even the some available resistant seeds are available are done in the research institutes. The issue of scaling up the seed production in many in different area in remote area is not developed. So that's causing some diseases to keep being spread, even the solution is somewhere available in the research stations. So that's where we spend most of the time discussing on the current threats. And for emerging threats, that's basically the same thing they elaborate presently, that kind of scaling up mostly on onion for Burkina Faso, that taking a lot of many species. You have the onion disease and the dieback that coming in many cash crops. And also the virus complexes, what Kuala was saying, they don't have a good understanding of the complex in they're finding the complex in the different crops. So that's something they need to elucidate, because they really don't know exactly what's going on when they have some highly pathogens or a lot of loss in the farms. So that's what we have. Okay, okay. Need to complete this, giving more precision on the different type of viruses instead to have the abbreviations. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you so much.
We didn't get to the 100K questions, yeah.
No problem, no problem. It was good that we had a division of that. Let me try to figure out the stuff certain. Well, I thought it was excellent. I mean, it's just really wonderful to, I mean, that's the whole point. We want to bring lots of people into a room and then hear from those, not just in us giving a polished talk, but hearing these counterpoints, which is really phenomenal. Based upon what we all heard now from the rooms we were not in, or just in general, is there any more comments that people would like to raise, or questions about how things are going? I think it's quite clear that we're going to be adopting the adaptive management framework. The other thing I would really stress that hasn't been there before, but I mentioned a little bit about how you know, funders have the money, so we're in the position of funding, and oftentimes that's a very it's an asymmetrical relationship, and the power imbalance is quite strong. I've certainly felt that a lot when I've been trying to glean some insights from Gates or whatever about money, but in the Plant Village culture, we have this radical structure where everybody talks out and speaks and challenges all the time, and that's critically important. So if you have a question that seems difficult, please just ask it and raise it, and also understand that we want to make sure that people are really putting forward their ideas and being in the driving seat. So it's not just us deciding this, because it's a collective effort. Okay, so any kind of responses there to all the stuff that we heard? Go ahead, Luis.
Yes, let me put my camera up. Yeah, this is just to add a comment regarding the 100K question. And because I was trying to think, because we're, as you and others in the room, we manage both multi-million-dollar grants and also the $100K grants. Obviously, the $100K grants will carry a long way if you go with small projects that are targeted to, say, a particular country with a very, very specific objective. But considering a lot of the indirects or the FNA that are going to be obviously put by both the sub-award, and maybe they have multiple partners also by the multiple partners, then I think that's a little bit constraining. Especially, obviously, I'm guessing that there won't be deep research questions addressed, but rather just implementing things that are already known.
Yeah, so that's true. You're right. The universities have hobbled themselves over the last number of years in terms of the well understood costs that come from such a large administration. So it doesn't allow us to be effective. So one of the ideas would be, let's imagine you're interested, or let me take Marisol at MSU. There she has to potential to work with Matthew that we heard about yesterday from on nematodes with the Dream Team. And one of the new projects coming out from IITA is protecting potatoes against nematodes, so we could use different technologies. It's very cheap to run a large experimental project on the efficacy of this new technology for potatoes, and then do research on that, and then also some economic data. Marisol could be part of that, and she could be funded to be for a couple of weeks of her time, for example, to be involved perhaps remotely, so reducing that travel burden on her. So she, as a nematode expert, could be working directly and getting the data. She could also drive forward a publication from this because she's good at publications and good at writing, or it could be some small portion of time for one of her postdocs. But the actual research on the ground, the randomized control study, that could happen very affordably because it is cheap to employ people in Kenya, and these young people are very capable. So that's one idea that we thought about, and we certainly need new, unusual approaches, because the historical model is that the money just gets eaten up, and then the cost of doing research is just too expensive. And if we continue,
that model sounds great, David. I love it. Just cover a few weeks of time of a postdoc. I think you can get a lot of work done that way. I think most of the money is eaten by the cost of the universities. Just MSU, the fees of having a graduate student are huge. I think you are very aware of it because you're in Penn State. So that sounds like a great idea.
Yeah. So that's experimenting with this for sure. I think Annalise, you were going to do the polls. Was that something I saw? Yeah, thanks. And so there might be a necessity to do larger. Oh, thank you so much. That's an excellent poll. There might be a necessity to do something larger. For example, let's say a lab, John Innes Center or Ohio State or something, or NC State could do some development of the nanopore technology, and it's going to take 2 years to get this up and running for a disease that we've never done before, like coffee rust. Then that's going to take a 2-year project, and it doesn't have to have deliverables, but it could be 2 years of a postdoc to focus on things. One thing that we do, and our partners understand this, and our new partners will learn about it, is that we're absolutely brutal in being focused on objectives and key results, taking that lesson from industry, particularly Google, and this is the framework where we meet weekly and we set our objectives and key results and we follow those. And it's not the traditional approach at universities. Universities are good at many things, but being very objective about a goal and then measuring the success of that goal is not something often we do, because the incentive structures are different. So we want to make sure that we're doing research for development in a very focused, orderly way. And we think in this way, we'll actually get more value for our money because it's important. Okay, this is neck and neck, huh? I would love to see a geographical breakdown of this, but we can't do this on Zoom, it seems, but it's super interesting. Dave, off you go.
Yeah, just a quick question. I mean, so you're adopting the Gates Grand Challenge model, but only part of it. So there was a two-pronged strategy from Gates, that they would do the quick wins, the 100K, but then there would be the competing for the really big prize of I think it was $1 million or something like that. So ideas that were really great, then they would sort of fund it through to take it forward. And I guess, like the Wolbachia story with malaria was the big one that came out of a quick win grand challenge, but then it went to scale. Yeah. So any thoughts on that? Are you going to have the scaling part as well, or just the quick win?
No, we're definitely going to have the scaling part. And so let me just be super transparent with how we've done for quick wins in the beginning, if I remember things correctly. I think it was about 170 for CIMMYT, $170,000. I think we then gave about 400,000 for the Dream Team, about UMass about 140 or something like that, Michigan State about 110. And these were roughly the projects to start. We didn't really know exactly what to do. NERA was about 100,000. IDE was about 90,000. Zamorano was about 100,000. And the idea is that these could lead to bigger pots of money, just like in your case. So in your case, with CIMMYT, we recognize now, because of our weekly meetings, just how extraordinarily capable all the work you've done is and important it is, and the work that Diana is doing for this. And that needs a lot more than 100,000. To my mind, it needs 5 or 6 million to build out the capacity across multiple issues. And so it's our job to go with you to donors, for example, the missions. So Coffee Rust is a problem for lots of missions, and as well as America. So we should have a pot of money that could develop these tools like you've done for Marple, but for Coffee Rust. And maybe that's, $1 to $2 million across 2 years, 3 years, to develop out these gene libraries and these tools and test them, and then everybody could immediately use it. And I don't believe if it's beneficial to 5 countries, let's say Ethiopia, Kenya, Honduras, Guatemala, and Kenya, if it's beneficial to 5 countries, that's only $400,000 each, so we could see a situation where we have this pool, and that's what funds that. So we want to advocate. And I may be completely naive in my thinking here, and USAID will inform us on this, but that's one idea. But we definitely have to scale up these promising responses. I think that's really critical, Dave, for sure. The other thing that, from a perspective, we spend every week together talking at length, working on these projects, going through our objectives and key results framework. And that's just helpful for getting more funding because of that built up relationship, the exchange, you guys telling us what's important. And then this idea of the way in which we've already invested is likely to invest further. So I think that's something that people should bear in mind. It's really good to keep an open relationship with us and engage us. Yeah. So what is the ideal amount for an award? So kind of a broad range there. That's interesting. And the other point about the 100,000 is it's just to kind of kickstart things, to build capacity, to get things going. But we also can do commissioned work. So it's not everything will be given away in the RFA process. We can also decide as a management entity that it's really important, for example, that we focus on wheat rust, and we can decide that it could be a $1 million grant. And then we build a proposal for this, and then we put it forward, and USAID says this is good, and then they would want to hear from our board. So let's say we go for Coffee Rust, and then our board members, particularly people like Jean Rustiano, who would carry a lot of weight because of her expertise in diagnostics. She would say, yeah, look, the world doesn't have this, and not only is it beneficial for the Feed the Future countries, it has a co-benefit because of the breakout of Coffee Rust in Hawaii, for example, or the $28 billion that coffee brings to the US economy every year. So then USAID would evaluate this and say, well, even though it wasn't an open competition, it is a valuable piece of work that we should be doing. So a lot of what we're doing is trying to raise money. I mentioned, I think this investment by the Gates Foundation, this cloud system that we want to build. That's at the moment it's a concept note we're developing. We're doing a lot of engagement with CG, FAO, groups in Aarhus in Denmark, Euroblight, to get that synergism, and that's as up to about 6.5 million, and that's to build a system in the cloud that everybody could use on day one. And we'll talk a little bit more about those systems tomorrow when we talk about climate change. Okay, so I think that this was an extremely productive and beneficial session. Anything from you, Serge, in what you want to close out, or Annalise, or?
Oh, just nothing too special. Thank you everyone for your participation and your inputs. I think it's really important for us to have your feedbacks and what you think about our different plans. And for sure, tomorrow's discussion is going to give us a good understanding about what's going on in your different working area. And the idea of emerging and current pests can really be hard to assess. So we believe that having you working directly on the ground to have our eyes everywhere will help us to prevent some big catastrophes. So I think being there and keeping things down when they start emerging is the best way to do things. And tomorrow we'll have more time to discuss what is pest or disease in your different countries. But what we already got today from the different participants gave us a good idea about how we need to turn our eyes on how we need to prepare for the next 5 years. Thank you very much.
The only thing I would add on is to echo what Serge said, which is that it is so important for us to hear from everyone on this call and those who are not on this call as well, to understand what the current landscape looks like on the ground, and then what we can expect in the future as well, so we can move away from this pest of the week mindset and start introducing longer term sustainable solutions that are a low effort behavior change for farmers to adopt. And all of this information comes from those of you who are working on the ground. And so I really look forward to continuing these conversations and adding on to that Google Doc every month as we hear from you on what's happening on the ground. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned the pest of the week. Melissa?
Yes, I just wanted to add in the breakout session room that I was in the Asia room, this was mentioned, I mentioned it, but the other rooms probably may not have known about it, is that starting for the second year when these smaller awards will be awarded, at Penn State, we've worked out a system where you can get funds up front. So this is especially true for the small narrows and other organizations that may not have monies up front to make purchases and then get reimbursed, which is currently the situation that we have with our 10 sub-awardees. But do know that moving forward, we have worked out a system where you can, if awarded money, the organization would be able to get some money up front to get started and make purchases and then draw down from that. And again, it would be based also on some deliverables, but to begin with, you could get some money up front to make those purchases.
Yeah, and Melissa's done just an extraordinary job of navigating all of this, and it's been very, very difficult as we've started. But having established it, we really want to kind of show that it can roll well. Marisol?
Yeah, I wanted to say something. Sometimes when you do integrated project, instead of you looking at one pest, but you look at multiple, maybe we can be more productive. For example, several trials that I did in Hawaii in a tropical environment with mulches, no-till, etc., turned out to have significant decrease of several pests and diseases like Alternaria in onions, and it reduced thrips, and it, some of these treatments reduce plant parasitic nematodes and leaf miners. What I'm saying is that we tended to talk about like pests and diseases as single things, but many times there's a treatment or a management strategy that can have impact in many. So I think collaborating among different specialists and looking at multiple pests and diseases together can end up being more productive for the grower, because the grower is not going to focus on one pest and disease. He's focused on yield and profit. So finding management practices that manage key pests and diseases and increase yield, I think that would be great, and that will require like collaborative effort.
Yeah, this is really one of the reasons why our biggest award has gone to an integrated pest management package. This was something that Edward Jott had developed in the previous innovation lab, and he's at Penn State. And so we have 5 components of that package. And we believe that in deploying that, we'll have overall resilience. And maybe tomorrow we'll speak about some of these resilience measures that we've been collecting and spearheaded by Annalise. And we have 4-point scale, and we want to get people from scale number 1 to number 4. But we completely agree. The overall package leads to greater resilience, and it has effects across a wide range of problems and pathogens, but it also has a great effect on the bottom line, which is of course front and center for what we have to focus on. We need to increase the economic performance of farms. Excellent. Well, I'm going to go off for a 2-hour meeting with FAO and develop some of these things. But it's been really encouraging. I thought I'd be tired after this one, but it's super exciting to talk to you all about this. So thank you so much indeed. And I'll take that enthusiasm into the next room I go into. And thank you so much. And we'll see you tomorrow, I hope, for the final day, where we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the issues which are facing us all and facing the farmers in Feed the Future country. So thank you all so much indeed for your enthusiasm and attention. Bye.
Great meeting, David. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Bye.